Hi guys. Tonight we're going to drift through the hush of time, down candlelit corridors of stone, through echoing chambers of royal courts, and into the fading footsteps of kings and queens who met their ends not in glory, but in whispered humiliation. Our tale explores some of the most embarrassing royal deaths in history, deaths that the scribes sometimes hushed, that chroniclers blushed to record. These are stories of monarchs undone by absurdity, betrayed by their own bodies, or claimed by fate in ways that mocked their crowns. Let us begin slowly with the tale of King Adolf Fredrik of Sweden. The night was thick with snow outside the palace in Stockholm in 1771, but within the grand halls of the royal residence, warmth poured from the hearths and banquets were laid in shimmering glory. King Adolf Fredrik, a monarch more known for his indulgences than for his rulership, had taken his seat at the table for what would become his final feast. Adolf had never truly ruled. His reign was marred by the constraints placed upon him by the Riksdag, Sweden's parliament. He was a king in name more than in power, a ceremonial figurehead who sought comfort not in conquest or statesmanship, but in pleasures of the palate. And on this particular day, Shrove Tuesday, a day of festivity before Lent, the king saw no reason to restrain himself. The table groaned under the weight of food, salted herring, meat stews, champagne, lobsters and other fineries. But it was the dessert that spelled his doom. Semla, soft, sweet cardamom buns filled with almond paste and served in bowls of warm milk. King Adolf was especially fond of them. That day, perhaps due to sorrow, stress, or the need to feel sovereign in some part of his life, he consumed not one or two, but reportedly 14 semla buns in one sitting. 14, floating luxuriously in milk, soaked and devoured one after another, his appetite unyielding even as his body began to rebel. What followed, according to accounts preserved by those in court, was a slow, painful night. The king complained of stomach cramps, a distended belly, and an unbearable pressure deep inside. His physicians, baffled and powerless, attempted purgatives and calming herbs, but the damage was done. In the early hours of the next morning, the King of Sweden died not in battle or in bed surrounded by family, but on a lavatory seat, groaning in agony, his system overwhelmed by gluttony. It was an ignoble death. Rumours soon spread, not just of the foods he had eaten, but of the undignified way he had passed, from indigestion, from a burst stomach, from the sheer weight of food. The royal court was embarrassed. Sweden's enemies snickered. Satirists, especially those abroad, seized the opportunity to mock a man who had been more interested in cream buns than in kingship. But King Adolf's story is not unique. Royalty, despite their grandeur, have never been immune to the absurdities of death. Indeed, some might say they are especially prone to it, so cocooned in ceremony, so sheltered from the realities of daily life, that the simplest mishap can bring their downfall. As the court mourned, as black cloth was draped across the windows and the bells tolled low and long over Stockholm, whispers stirred of other monarchs who had died as foolishly, as shamefully. In his final moments, Adolf Fredrik became a symbol, not of sovereignty, but of the fragile line between indulgence and demise. His death would enter history not for its tragedy, but for its ridiculousness, a moment when the divine right of kings collided with the all-too-human weakness for desert. His legacy, though he had signed edicts and opened parliaments, would forever be bound to a bowl of milk and buns. Somewhere, in the quiet of the night, the servants of the palace scrubbed away the last traces of his passing, trying to erase the smell, the stains, the shame. But memories linger longer than sense, and this memory was too absurd to die. The jesters remembered. The taverns told tales, and thus King Adolf Fredrik became the punchline of European monarchies, forever crowned, but also forever stuffed. And as one life ended in absurdity, history turns to another, across the sea, into a colder castle, where another monarch met his end not in shame, but in sheer, tragic stupidity. The mist curled like smoke over the River Usk in South Wales, carrying with it the scent of peat and cold iron. At the edge of a forest now long lost to history, the grey stones of Berkeley Castle caught the morning light, glowing faintly in the silence of the March air. It was the year 1327, and within those walls a king once draped in gold and crowned beneath Westminster's vaults now sat in darkness, dethroned, defamed, and very much alive. Edward II had once ruled England with regal dignity, if not with wisdom. His reign, however, had been a troubled one, marked by favouritism, military blunders, and a fatal detachment from the feudal realities of his barons. He was a man out of place, a poet in a court of soldiers, a dreamer in a time of blood. He adored music, fine clothes, and the companionship of men who whispered rather than shouted. To many he seemed soft, too refined for the iron crown he wore. The nobles, led by his wife Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer, had grown weary of his weakness. They stripped him of his throne, locked him in remote castles, and debated whether to spare him or let him vanish entirely into the mist of history. In September, he arrived at Berkeley Castle under heavy guard, his fate still uncertain. At first, the captors did not abuse him. They let him walk the grounds in the evening under watchful eyes. He ate, though sparingly, and he wept often. Letters from the Archbishop of Canterbury begged the wardens to treat the former king kindly, to see him as a soul still anointed by God, however fallen. But Mortimer's will was heavier than mercy. By June of the following year, whispers drifted across the land that Edward was plotting escape. Whether these were true or invented, they gave his jailers the excuse they needed to act. On a moonless night, a plan was laid, a plan to rid the realm of Edward Plantagenet forever, and to do so in such a way that no wound would be seen upon his flesh. What happened next would echo through centuries not just for its cruelty, but for its singular obscenity. The method of execution chosen was as precise as it was perverse. A red-hot poker thrust into the most intimate recess of his body was to burn away his insides, leaving no outward mark. His screams, they said, were muffled beneath the howls of baying dogs loosed into the courtyard. The guards would later speak in veiled terms, avoiding details, though one, long after, spoke of the stench that lingered and the sound that haunted his dreams. It is possible, of course, that this story was exaggerated by enemies or scandalized chroniclers. Some believe Edward may have died in another way or lived on in secrecy under a new identity. But the tale of the poker persisted. It fed a nation's gossip, gave the new rulers a silence to fill with shadows, and left a stain that no amount of royal proclamation could scrub clean. Edward II's death, whether truly so gruesome or merely whispered into infamy, became a dark legend. It was not simply his murder that shocked the world, but the nature of it. A punishment not of a king, but of a man humiliated to his very core. His fall was complete, from the throne to the dungeon, from crown to cinders. The people who once cheered him or mocked him now spoke of him in hushed tones. They did not mourn him with banners or songs, but with unease. What kind of realm, they wondered, allows such a death to occur? What does it say of justice when vengeance wears the robes of state? Edward's son, Edward III, would rise to avenge his father, if not openly, then with icy precision. Mortimer would be hanged, Isabella imprisoned. The sins of the parents bore bitter fruit in the next generation. And still, through all the centuries, the tale remained. Not for its politics, nor even for its horror, but for its sheer unbearable indecency. A death so private, made so grotesquely public. A king turned into a cautionary tale, not of weakness, but of the cruel imagination of those who wield power with no soul behind their eyes. Berkeley Castle still stands. Its stones have seen centuries pass, but beneath the floorboards, behind the old oak doors, the air remembers. It clings to the unspeakable, the silent crime in the dead of night. And somewhere, in the shifting fog that creeps through the valley, the sorrow of Edward's last moments lingers, unseen but not unfelt. And beyond England, another land waits, a kingdom of gold and wine, where a queen would one day meet a fate just as terrible, not by iron, but by a most unexpected and fatal misstep. The court of Navarre shimmered beneath a late spring sun, and from the distant slopes of the Pyrenees, wildflowers spilled in ribbons down to the castle walls. The air held the scent of lavender and warmed honey, and the gardens of the Palace of Pamplona sang softly with birds and laughter. It was here, in this fragrant corner of the 14th century world, that Queen Joanna I of Navarre once reigned. A woman of grace, intelligence, and a tragic destiny spun with such bitter irony that even her enemies could not help but speak of it in hushed disbelief. Joanna had been born to privilege, her titles as abundant as the vineyards that lined her kingdom, Queen of Navarre, Countess of Champagne, and by marriage, Queen Consort of France. Her union with Philip IV, the Iron King, was as strategic as it was tense. A bond meant to unite territories and dynasties, yet one shadowed by mistrust and coldness. Philip was a monarch of towering presence, rigid and severe, and though Joanna bore him children, including the future King Louis Theng, she remained ever at the edge of his affections. Despite the chill of her marital alliance, Joanna carved a space for herself. She governed Navarre with thoughtfulness and order, nurturing her court into a centre of learning and art. She walked among poets, heard the counsel of abbots, and stood beside generals. Though she had little power in France, in Navarre, she was sovereign in deed and spirit. But fate, ever the cruel scribe, would ensure that her final chapter would not be written with the dignity she had so often preserved. It began with an illness, unremarkable at first. A chill caught during a damp spring night, a slight fever, the ache of joints long used to courtly dances and council chambers. Her physicians were summoned. They prescribed infusions of sage, cool compresses, and whispered prayers. Yet her condition worsened. In her later years, Joanna had become increasingly frail, her strength dwindling under the weight of stress, loss, and perhaps the regret of a life where power and affection rarely touched. As her fever climbed, her attendants sought a radical solution, a treatment not uncommon in the medieval medical repertoire, yet one that would prove disastrous. The body, they believed, must be purged of its poisonous vapours, and one of the most popular methods was the application of heated substances to draw out illness. This is where the tale turns from the tragic to the grotesque. Joanna was placed in bed, her body swathed in cloths soaked with brandy. Her skin, pale and waxen, was to be stimulated by warmth, the alcohol acting as both cleanser and carrier. The plan was to gently heat the room and allow the fumes to ease her breath, to pull the sickness from her pores. But someone, perhaps a servant, perhaps a well-meaning apothecary, brought fire too close. A candle, flickering with innocent purpose, touched the alcohol-soaked cloth, and in a moment, flame met Queen. The fire roared to life, catching the linens and licking up the canopy of her bed. Panic erupted. Servants screamed. Buckets of water were dashed against the blaze, but the damage had been done. Joanna's body was terribly burned. Her cries, it is said, echoed down the stone corridors, bouncing from tapestry to tapestry until they became too terrible to bear. By the time the flames were subdued, there was little left of the Queen's dignity. Her body, scorched and blistered, could not endure the agony for long. She died not in the arms of family, not with the rites of royalty, but shrouded in smoke, her final breath choked by accident and horror. The court, stunned, could scarcely accept the truth. They dressed her remains in silks and pearls, hid the marks beneath veils and alabaster, and told the world it was illness that took her. But those who were there, the handmaidens the monks summoned too late, the guards who smelled the ash clinging to her chamber, knew the truth. There were whispers that the fire was no accident, that perhaps a rival at court, jealous of her influence, had engineered her death. But no proof ever came. Only silence, and a scent that lingered in her quarters far longer than anyone dared admit. Joanna's death passed into legend more as a curiosity than a scandal. In the years that followed, chronicles would briefly mention her demise, often skipping the fire and speaking instead of a sudden illness. But folklore told another version, of a queen set ablaze not by sin or sorcery, but by the clumsy hand of medieval medicine. Her husband, Philip IV, barely mourned her, already consumed by his obsession with the suppression of the Knights Templar. Her children wept, though none were present. And Navarre, that gentle kingdom of hills and song, fell into mourning for the queen who had once walked its stone paths with so much quiet dignity. Thus passed Joanna I of Navarre, not with a crown upon her brow or prayers upon her lips, but beneath smoke, her body betrayed by the very hands that sought to heal it. And as her story settled into the shadows of time, it became a cruel whisper, that even queens with all their power and poise can perish from a single spark. Far to the east, another royal figure approached his own foolish end, one that would involve not fire nor illness, but a misstep, a door, and the pressing weight of fashion and pride. The court of Burgundy in the early 15th century was one of unmatched splendour, a place where velvet swept over marble, where goblets of jewelled silver clinked with ruby-red wine, and where the dance of diplomacy was as delicate and dangerous as the flicker of candlelight on polished steel. At its heart stood Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, whose ambition reached higher than the tower bells of Dijon, and whose end would come not from enemy blade nor whispered poison, but from the curious convergence of clothing and architecture. Charles, born into a world already humming with conflict, bore a name that pulsed with expectation. His father, Philip the Good, had carved a duchy of stunning influence from the patchwork of France and the Low Countries. It was Charles, however, who dreamed of turning Burgundy into a true kingdom, equal to France, to England, to the Holy Roman Empire itself. He carried himself with the gravity of a sovereign before he had earned the title, and his pride was stitched into every seam of his armour, every inch of his towering figure. He was not a fool, not in the classical sense. He was a warrior, stern and shrewd, and he had won battles and bent men to his will with equal finesse. But he had one weakness, and it was not wine, or love, or even gold. It was dignity, an overwhelming need to appear unshakably royal, even when discretion or humility would have saved him. It was the winter of 1477, and Charles was at war again, as he often was. His armies had marched deep into Lorraine, determined to seize Nancy, a city that refused to yield to his might. The snows came hard that season, and his soldiers, many exhausted, many starving, grew restless beneath the pale skies. Yet Charles pressed on, unwilling to appear weak, unwilling to wait for spring. The night before the battle, he dressed with care. His armour was gilded, his cloak woven with the deep red of Burgundian pride. Beneath the steel he wore furs and silks, and atop his head sat a helmet polished to a mirrored sheen. He looked not like a soldier, but like a monarch descending into a portrait. He intended not just to lead the charge, but to embody it, to be seen, to be feared, to be remembered. But Charles's death would not come from the lance of an enemy knight nor the volley of an archer. It would come, in part, from the absurd weight of his own regalia. As the battle raged in the early hours of January 5th, fog rolled across the fields of Nancy like the breath of ancient ghosts. Visibility dropped to mere yards, and the once organised front of Charles's army splintered into confusion. The Swiss and Lorrainers attacked from flanks, their tactics swift and brutal. Amid the panic, Charles found himself separated from his core guard. The snow turned to slush beneath hooves and boots, and the sounds of men dying filled the air. He tried to retreat. He tried to rejoin his men. But his cloak snagged on a tree root. His armour, ornate and cumbersome, slowed him more than it protected him. And as he turned, perhaps to lift his blade, perhaps only to flee, a blow struck him down. It is not clear whose weapon ended him. Perhaps it was an enemy soldier unaware of the identity of the gilded man he slew. Perhaps it was several. There were no grand duels, no dramatic final speeches. Charles the Bold died faceless in the mud, his corpse later identified only by his scorched face and the marks on his teeth. But the strangest detail came from those who found him. His body, frozen in the bloody snow, had not just been pierced and broken. It had been stripped of its outer cloak, trampled not just by enemy soldiers, but by his own obsession with appearance. His richly decorated garments had betrayed him. The bright reds and golds made him a target. The weight of his robes had tangled his stride, and his armour, meant to inspire awe, had kept him from rising when the fatal strike came. News of his death reached Burgundy slowly, like a shadow falling across the stained glass of a cathedral. The duchy reeled. His daughter, Mary of Burgundy, was thrust into chaos. The great kingdom he had tried to build collapsed within months, swallowed by the ambitions of neighbouring powers. Charles's legacy became tangled in mockery. His moniker, the Bold, remained, but now it came with a smirk. Poets whispered of his vanity, his need to shine even on the battlefield. They told of a man who dressed for coronation and marched into death. And as his corpse was borne home, the fine silks he once wore hung in tatters, unfit even for the beggars who lined the roads. Today his tomb lies in Bruges, carved with care and solemnity. He lies in marble, his face serene, his sword by his side. But no stone, no sculpture can quite erase the manner of his death, the Duke undone not by enemies, but by his own desire to appear immortal. Not far from Burgundy, in a realm of proud fortresses and gilded salons, another king would meet his end, not on the battlefield, but behind a closed door. defeated not by arms, but by an absurd architectural oversight and a robe too wide to pass through. In the lush heart of France, where the Loire curled through forests like a serpent of silver and chateaux rose from the hills like dreams of old stone, there once reigned a king whose end would defy the poetry of his court. Louis III of France, young and gallant, was barely more than a boy when fate came racing toward him, not in the form of war or sickness, but as a wooden doorway and a galloping horse. The year was 882, and the Carolingian Empire, fractured and weary, saw in Louis a flicker of stability. He was a grandson of Charles the Bald and the second son of Louis the Stammerer. Though the blood of Charlemagne flowed in his veins, the world he inherited was already crumbling, divided lands, rebellious vassals and borders trembling under the threat of Norseman raids. Still, Louis seemed to rise with promise. He was youthful and eager, ruling with his brother Carloman II after their father's death. While he possessed none of the ruthlessness of his ancestors, Louis had a temperate spirit and a surprising sense of discipline for one so young. He spent most of his short reign attempting to quell internal unrest, riding from province to province in an effort to stabilize the kingdom. But it was in a small town in the north, in a quiet summer afternoon, that his life came to an absurd and sudden halt. The chronicles tell of a girl, a young woman of beauty, who lived near the court's temporary lodgings in Saint-Denis. Some claimed she was a noble's daughter, others that she was a common maiden with golden hair and a smile that softened stone. What matters is that Louis, smitten beyond all reason, gave chase. He was on horseback, clad not in armour but in a lighter courtly robe, the kind worn during times of ease rather than combat. His attendants, struggling to match his enthusiasm, watched in disbelief as the king galloped ahead alone, laughter chasing after him like dust in his wake. The girl had disappeared into a nearby building, a manor, or perhaps a barn repurposed for housing. Louis, not thinking, not slowing, followed. The doorway was too low. He stood tall in the saddle, head lifted, wind in his hair. He never ducked. Perhaps he thought the door wider. Or perhaps he imagined his passage as a charge of romantic valour. But in that moment, with speed as his enemy and wood as his executioner, the frame struck him. The blow was immediate and devastating. His skull cracked with a sound so sharp that witnesses were stunned into silence. He was thrown backwards from the horse, limbs askew, his fine robe twisted around his frame like tangled ivy. Blood stained the earth, dark and swift. The horse stumbled to a halt, riderless, confused. Louis never rose again. He was only around 17 years old. The court reeled. How could a king so young, so full of promise, be undone by something so ludicrous? Not a battlefield, not an assassin's blade, not even a fever in the night, but a doorway. A doorway too short for his pride, too narrow for his speed. Some whispered that it was a punishment for lust, a divine retribution for abandoning his duties for the thrill of pursuit. Others, more quietly, admitted it was simply a foolish accident, a moment of youthful exuberance turned fatal. His body was taken to the Abbey of Saint-Denis, buried among the bones of kings who had fallen in far more dignified ways. And there, among warriors and emperors, lay a boy felled by wood and haste. The monks prayed, the court grieved, but the people, they laughed. Quietly, behind closed shutters, they spoke of the king who chased a girl and lost his crown to a doorframe. It became a tavern tale, a song for the wine-soaked and weary. "Duck, lest you meet Louis's fate," they'd say, raising mugs and ducking in jest. And as the years turned, Louis's name faded from glory and into oddity. He ruled for barely a breath, and yet his death was etched more vividly than the laws he passed or the land he tried to govern. A boy king, riding for beauty, felled not by battle or betrayal, but by miscalculation. A reminder that for all the power a crown may hold, it cannot protect against foolishness. Not far beyond France's borders, in the green kingdoms of Scotland, another monarch would one day fall. His end not by gallop nor fire, but in a silent moment, beneath a cliff's edge, under stars that would never see him rise again. The Scottish Highlands, veiled in perpetual mist and cradled by mountains as old as myth, held secrets that even the bravest warriors dared not disturb. Among their ridges and glens, where stone cottages clung to life against the wind and lochs mirrored the sky in melancholic silence, the fate of one Scottish king would be sealed by a solitary moment. One footstep, one misjudged edge, and a darkness that swallowed him whole. King Alexander III of Scotland had ruled with an uncommon steadiness. His reign, beginning in the middle of the 13th century, was marked not by conquest or ruin, but by peace, an increasingly rare jewel in a time of near-constant conflict. Under his guidance, Scotland flourished. Trade blossomed. The borders, once so fluid and bloodied, held firm. He had married well, produced heirs, and maintained a tenuous but workable peace with England. Yet peace, however carefully cultivated, is a delicate thread, and fate does not measure kings by their wisdom or their wars, but by the moments they do not see coming. It was the night of March 18th, 1286. The wind howled across the Firth of Forth like a banshee loosed from the underworld. Rain came in icy sheets, needling through cloaks and extinguishing torches. Alexander, returning from a council meeting in Edinburgh, had insisted on making his way to Kinghorn, where his second wife awaited him. Against all counsel, his advisers, his guards, even his physicians, he refused to remain sheltered. The king, it seemed, had grown impatient. He was newly remarried, and perhaps the warmth of his young bride beckoned stronger than reason. Or perhaps, with the loss of his children in the years prior, he feared the silence of his halls more than the storm. Whatever drove him, he mounted his horse and began the perilous journey along the cliffside path, accompanied only by a few attendants. The darkness was near absolute. The moon, cloaked in rolling clouds, offered no guidance. The path itself, narrow and worn by centuries of hooves and weather, slithered along the cliffs above the sea. A wrong step could lead not to mere injury, but to oblivion. And somewhere along that black edge, Alexander's fate met him. No one saw the fall. What is known is that, at some point, the king became separated from his party. Whether his horse stumbled or he dismounted and lost his footing remains unknown. But by morning, his body was found broken at the base of the cliffs near Petticoat. His neck had snapped, his spine twisted cruelly. The horse was found nearby, shaken but unscathed, grazing on salt grass as if unaware of the crown it had just outlived. The kingdom was thrown into chaos. Alexander's only surviving heir had died years before, and his granddaughter Margaret, the Maid of Norway, was too young to rule. With the king's death, Scotland plunged into what would become known as the Great Cause, a succession crisis that eventually invited English interference and sparked the wars of Scottish independence. And yet, for all the wars and bloodshed that followed, it was the simple image of the king's fall that haunted the people most. A man of wisdom, patience, and calm, undone not by rebellion or poison or steel, but by the unseen edge of a cliff in the dark. There was no heroism in it. No last stand, no dying words, just wind and stone and a drop into silence. The chroniclers struggled with how to portray such a death. It was unworthy of a monarch, undramatic and senseless. They cloaked it in metaphor, suggesting perhaps that God had called him home, or that his destiny had been fulfilled. But in the minds of the common folk, the tale grew stranger. Some said he had been pulled over the edge by a ghost. Others claimed he had seen a vision on the path, a glowing woman in white who beckoned him into the void. None of it mattered. Scotland had lost its king, and with him it lost the last breath of peace before a century of smoke and blood. Today, on the cliffs near Kinghorn, the sea still crashes against the rocks with relentless rhythm. Tourists come, unaware of the ghost they stand above. And the wind, sharp, ceaseless, whispers not in Gaelic nor in song, but in something older, colder. It tells no tales, but it remembers the fall. And far across the channel, in a city of towers and stained glass, a French king would meet his end in a room filled with scent, shadow, and the betrayal of a most private, agonizing failure. The city of Paris, in the 14th century, was a labyrinth of candlelit corridors, incense-thick chapels, and gardens where roses bloomed with impossible defiance. Within its palaces, kings moved as demigods, their every step watched by servants and scribes, their every breath wrapped in the velvet of ritual. And yet, no height of glory could protect a sovereign from the treachery of the flesh. In the case of King Charles VIII of France, it would be a doorway once more, simple, silent, and unyielding, that brought a dynasty to its knees. Charles had ascended to the throne in 1483, barely 13 years old, and though he matured into rule with some success, he remained ever youthful in appearance. Small, slight, and pale-faced, with a nervous energy that clung to him like perfume. He was known for his piety, for his love of chivalric romances, and for his disastrous campaign in Italy, which left France entangled in foreign ambitions it could neither sustain nor win. Still, upon his return, Charles tried to settle into the rhythm of domestic governance. His court was lively. His queen, Anne of Brittany, gave him legitimacy in the fractious realm, and his tastes remained simple for a king. Stories of knights, jousts, and games played with a boy's enthusiasm. That boyishness, however, would prove fatal. On April 7th, 1498, Charles had risen early. The occasion was light-hearted. A game of jeu de paume, the predecessor to modern tennis, was to be played at the Château d'Amboise. The corridors were bustling with chatter, courtiers arranging their silk, pages rushing with trays of wine and polished boots. Charles, feeling well, chose to walk to the court on foot. The air was warm with spring, and laughter followed him as he passed beneath vaulted arches and beneath carved stone ceilings. Ahead of him, the gallery narrowed into a passage. Servants bowed, musicians tuned their lutes in a nearby chamber. The scent of rosemary from the kitchens hung sweet in the air. And then, without warning, Charles struck the lintel of a low doorway with his head. It was not a particularly hard blow, not at first. He stumbled, placed a hand on the wall, and forced a smile to reassure those nearby. But within moments the smile faltered. His face turned pale. He whispered that he felt unwell. Then, slowly, he sank to the floor. He was carried to a nearby chamber, placed on cushions and tended to by the best physicians the court could muster. But something unseen had shifted within him. Some said it was a cerebral hemorrhage, others whispered of a hidden aneurysm. Whatever the cause, Charles never rose again. By evening he was dead, felled not by a war, not by a conspiracy, but by the architecture of his own home. He was 27 years old. The court was paralyzed. The succession was unclear, and the shock of his death, so sudden, so absurd, made it all the more unnerving. Anne, his queen, reportedly broke down in inconsolable grief, not just for her husband, but for the children they had lost together, and for the crown that now seemed adrift. Charles VIII's reign had not been glorious, but his death made him a figure of strange pity. A king who had lived surrounded by the splendor of France's rebirth, undone by a single misstep. The doorway, mere inches too low for his hurried stride, became infamous. Architects whispered of it, superstitious courtiers began to duck under every arch, and masons were quietly instructed to adjust thresholds throughout the palace. But among the people, the tale spread with dark amusement. They told it in taverns, with exaggerated flair, the king who ran into a wall and fell into death like a character from a jest. Poets, less kind, compared him to Icarus, not for flying too high, but for never learning how to walk among mortals. Yet, in private corners, in monastic libraries and among old noble families, the story settled into sadness. Charles had not been cruel, nor vain, nor reckless in the way of other monarchs. He had simply been fragile, too eager, too human. And when death came, it wore not a crown nor a scythe, but a wooden beam, smooth with age, awaiting a brow that never saw it coming. And so France passed from one king to another, the Valois dynasty inching closer to its twilight. And far to the south, in the gilded chambers of Naples, another royal man would meet his end, not by architecture or accident, but by the inescapable betrayal of the body's slow collapse, in a room heavy with heat, regret, and breathless finality. The city of Naples sweltered under the unforgiving sun of late summer, its marble piazzas shimmering with heat, and the sea beyond the harbour lying flat and breathless, like a pane of glass stretched to the horizon. Within the cool shadowed walls of the Castel dell'Ovo, once a fortress and now the quiet retreat of royalty, an old man lay dying. Ferdinand I of Naples, called Ferrante, had once commanded fleets and silenced rebellions, but in the end, his power could not silence the slow betrayal of his own flesh. Ferdinand was born a bastard. The illegitimate son of Alfonso I of Aragon, he was not expected to wear a crown, yet through cunning and conquest he rose to rule the kingdom of Naples. His reign was long and often ruthless. He crushed the barons who defied him, constructed elaborate fortifications, and fostered the Renaissance arts even as he waded through blood. He was feared, respected, and deeply disliked by many who knelt before him. He ruled for over 30 years, outlasting plots and invasions, including the ever-looming threat of the French, who claimed Naples as their right. Yet his later years were marked not by grandeur, but by growing isolation. His beloved wife had died, his trusted allies aged and faded away. And the king, once feared as a lion of the Mediterranean, began to wither from within. It began with a tremble in his fingers. Then a slowness in his stride. His physicians, masters of both Galenic traditions and the newer philosophies of anatomy, prescribed leeches, powders, crushed pearls, and tinctures of myrrh. But nothing stopped the wasting. His skin yellowed. His breath came in short, hissing gasps. His meals went untouched. Whispers began to float through the court. Was it a fever? Was it poison? Or was it the weight of all the sins he had once carried with such grim pride? Ferdinand himself seemed to believe in a more divine cause. He ordered masses said in every church of Naples. He confessed with startling candour to his chaplain, naming sins both known and secret. He ordered his rooms cleared of luxury, choosing to die not among gold and velvet, but in linen and candlelight. The only indulgence he allowed was the scent of oranges, which he kept by his bedside, their sharp sweetness cutting through the sickly air. And yet, the indignity of his decline was impossible to veil. His bowels failed him, his legs swelled grotesquely, his teeth fell one by one, until even speech became an effort of pain. Once he had spoken like Cicero, penning letters with the precision of a jurist. Now he moaned and clawed at his sheets, delirious with fever, demanding water one moment and then screaming at the taste of it the next. What truly made his end infamous, however, was not the illness itself, but what happened after he died. On January 25th, 1494, King Ferdinand I of Naples took his last breath. The room was silent except for the scratching of quills as notaries recorded the moment. His heir, Alfonso II, stood in grim silence, already burdened by the mantle of rule. The body was prepared with haste, for even in death it had begun to rot with unnatural speed. Within hours the stench was unbearable. Attendants tried to mask it with incense, cloves, and camphor. The court's apothecaries used their strongest balms, stuffing the king's nostrils and mouth with soaked cloths. But nothing helped. The body so recently living, bloated and blackened. It oozed, it burst in places, the skin peeled in sheets. A priest fainted. A guard vomited. The corridors outside his chamber had to be abandoned. Birds, disturbed by the scent, took flight from the palace roof. Rumours spread like wildfire that the king's soul had fled in horror or that the devil had claimed his corpse. Some said that God had sent a sign, that this man, who had once adorned his dungeons with the bones of rebellious nobles, could not rest in peace. His burial was rushed. The funeral procession, intended to be grand and public, was diverted through side streets to avoid drawing crowds who might recoil in disgust. The body was sealed in a sarcophagus thick with lead, entombed in the church of San Domenico Maggiore. No grand elegy was read aloud. The musicians played softly, as if to avoid waking something that should not stir. The memory of Ferdinand's reign faded in the shadows of his grotesque death. His military victories, his patronage of learning, his complicated diplomacy with the papacy, all these were eclipsed by the image of a body so foul in decay it had to be buried like a plague victim. And thus, the legacy of a powerful king rotted alongside the flesh that once bore it. Yet across the continent, in a colder palace beneath the silver skies of the north, another ruler's demise would come not with decay nor disease, but in a moment of strange pleasure turned terminal, his breath caught not by horror, but by laughter. The court of Denmark in the 18th century was a place of manners and measured elegance. Chandeliers dripped with crystal light, powdered wigs stood high as pride, and the laughter of nobles, muted beneath etiquette, echoed lightly off marble halls. But even in this world of candlelit control and rigid ritual, death sometimes slipped in wearing a grin. And when it came for King Christian II, it did so with a kind of tragic mischief, drawing breath from the lungs of a man who had never quite belonged to the throne he wore. Christian had been born into expectation, a son of Denmark and Norway, crowned king before he turned 17. But he carried within him a restlessness that no title could tame. From childhood his behaviour was erratic, brilliant one moment, violent the next. He wept during state ceremonies. He laughed in funerals. He spoke with ghosts, raged against shadows, and disappeared from banquets to speak with the dead beneath the palace eaves. Modern historians now suggest he suffered from schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, though in his own time he was simply called mad. Yet madness did not rob him of charm. Christian could be sweet, disarmingly clever, and quick with a joke that danced just at the edge of inappropriateness. He loved the theatre, music, and the company of clever men and beautiful women. But he hated responsibility. He loathed the constraints of statecraft. And so Denmark was largely ruled by others, first by his physician, then by court advisors, and finally by his son. As Christian aged, his body weakened, but his mind, though fractured, found strange joys in simple pleasures. He loved long walks through the palace gardens, games of chess with servants, and curiously, moments of unrestrained laughter. It was in laughter that he seemed most himself, as if whatever storm raged in his brain could briefly be held at bay by the sound of delight. In early 1808, the king, now nearly 60, lived in semi-retirement at Rendsburg, far from the politics of Copenhagen. His daily life was a blur of gentle routines and quiet observation. Those who served him were instructed to keep the atmosphere calm, to avoid agitation, and above all, to preserve his dignity. But fate, always the greatest court jester, had other plans. One morning, as the king sat in his favourite chair beneath a high-arched window, a servant entered with a newspaper. Christian, whose reading was often selective and impulsive, seized it eagerly. He was fond of the satirical pages, of cartoons and small absurdities that played with the vanity of men in powdered coats. That day, there was a particular article, an anonymous piece poking fun at a Prussian envoy who had recently visited the court, a man famous for his long speeches and poor French. The account was exaggerated, mocking, and in Christian's fragile state, outrageously funny. He began to laugh. It started as a quiet chuckle, shoulders trembling under his fur-lined robe. Then it built, deeper, louder, the sound echoing through the quiet chamber. His valet, unsure whether to intervene, hesitated at the door. Christian leaned forward, gasping, tears in his eyes. His whole body rocked with laughter. He clutched his sides, coughing between breaths, and yet he could not stop. The words from the article seemed to loop in his mind, growing ever more absurd. And then he froze. His eyes widened, and he gasped once more, not with laughter this time, but with pain. His hand rose to his chest. He opened his mouth, perhaps to speak, but no words came. He toppled forward, his face striking the edge of the small table beside him. The valet rushed to his side, shouting for help. But Christian VII, King of Denmark and Norway, was already gone. The official cause was cardiac arrest. His heart, weakened by age and years of mental anguish, simply gave out. But among those who witnessed it, the story became something else. The king, they said, had laughed himself to death. And it was true enough. No poison, no blade, no disease. Just a moment of unguarded joy, a ripple of absurdity that overtook a fragile body already leaning toward the grave. The court, embarrassed, tried to hush the story. The article was destroyed, servants were silenced, but whispers persisted. He died smiling, they said. The mad king laughed at the world one last time, and then it let him go. His son, Frederick VI, inherited the throne fully, having already ruled in practice for many years. He ordered the funeral to be conducted with grace and restraint, and Christian's memory was wrapped in solemn dignity. But among the Danish people, the tale lived on differently. Children giggled at bedtime stories of the laughing king. Actors added the anecdote to performances, bowing low and slapping their chests in mock collapse. And in hidden corners of Copenhagen, where candlelight flickered against panelled walls, men raised glasses not in mourning, but in mirth. For here was a king who, after a lifetime of torment, had died not with a scream, but with a laugh. Elsewhere in Europe, however, a royal life would end with no mirth, no pride, and no ceremony. Only a chamber pot, a scream in the dark, and a final moment so indecent that even time has tried to forget it. The air in Versailles was thick with perfume and pretension. By the mid-18th century, the palace had become more than a royal residence. It was a theatre of power, where every glance, every bow, every rustle of silk played its part in a performance centuries in the making. Yet behind the gilded doors, behind the mirrors and fountains and powdered smiles, there existed a darker truth, that kings were not gods, but men. And when their bodies betrayed them, it was not always behind velvet curtains. Louis II, known as Louis le Grand Dauphin, was the son of Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, and heir to the most powerful throne in Europe. Born into magnificence, he was never quite the equal of his dazzling father, nor as cunning as his son, the future Louis XIV. But he was solid, dependable, and widely expected to rule with reason and restraint once the old king passed. He never would. The crown passed over him, skipping from brilliance to disaster, leaving the Dauphin to die not on a battlefield or in council, but in the most humiliating way imaginable, in his own privy. He had always been indulgent. Fond of food, heavy wines, and the idle comforts of court life, Louis had grown into a large man, both in stature and appetite. He was intelligent but politically inactive, preferring to retreat into his rooms rather than grapple with the endless scheming of Versailles. Some said he was lazy. Others claimed he was simply too human for the godlike burden of kingship. He raised his children with quiet affection and maintained a small circle of trusted friends, though rarely took public initiative. He was neither hero nor villain, merely a man waiting his turn, one that would never come. By 1711, he was in his late 40s and already burdened by gout and corpulence. That spring, following a particularly extravagant meal, roasted pheasant, oysters, wine, and an excess of candied fruit, the Dauphin began to feel unwell. It was the sort of discomfort he had felt before, a heaviness in the gut, a cold sweat behind the ears, and an urgent need to be alone. He excused himself discreetly and retired to his private latrine. What happened next was pieced together by horrified attendants and whispered among courtiers for years. The Dauphin was found slumped over the commode, his trousers at his knees, his face contorted in a frozen gasp of agony. He had suffered a massive internal rupture. Some claimed it was an aneurysm, others a stroke or an apoplectic seizure brought on by the violent strain of digestion. Whatever the cause, he had died as he lived, quietly, privately, away from the great stage. But his location, his posture, was what turned a noble death into scandal. Despite the palace's best efforts to shroud the truth, word slipped out. Servants spoke to servants, pages gossiped in shadows. The tale spread like fire through the salons of Paris and beyond. The future king of France, found dead on a toilet, half naked, his mouth open in a cry never heard. The symbolism was too rich, too vulgar, too perfect. The heir to the greatest monarchy in Europe, undone not by war or treason, but by his own bowels. Enlightenment philosophers seized upon it as a metaphor for decadence. Satirists penned crude verses. Even the clergy, usually reverent toward royalty, shook their heads in dismay. Louis XIV, already an old man with decades of rule behind him, was said to have received the news with a cold stare and a long silence. He outlived his son by 4 more years, burying the heir he had groomed so long. In time, the throne would pass to Louis IV, who would himself die in shame, reviled and rotting, as revolution simmered in the veins of the people. But for all the blood spilled in France's long history, the Dauphin's end lingered in a different way. It was whispered in drawing rooms with a stifled chuckle. It was hinted at in paintings, where the pose of a figure on a chair might carry a grim double meaning. It entered the folklore of Versailles, that even the most refined of men, even those born beneath crystal chandeliers and reared on milk touched by gold, could meet their end in the most undignified place imaginable. Today, the room where he died is long gone, its walls torn down and reimagined by centuries of renovations. But the echo remains, not just of the man, but of the moment. A reminder that no velvet robe, no powdered wig, no lineage traced through a dozen kings can preserve a body from its own quiet collapse. And as the wind swept across the gardens of Versailles that spring, perfumed with lilac and grief, another royal figure, this time a Tsar from the East, was entering the final days of his life, a giant of a man who would be brought down not by sword, not by court intrigue, but by something far more intimate and grotesque. The Russian winter was not a season but a force, stretching over the land like a second sky, white, merciless and eternal. It blanketed palaces in silence, turned forests to frozen cathedrals, and made even the breath of Tsars turn to frost in the air. In the waning days of January 1725, as the Neva froze solid and St. Petersburg stood rigid in its icy magnificence, Tsar Peter the Great lay gasping in a chamber, thick with incense, urine and dread. The man who had dragged Russia into the modern age, who had built a navy from nothing and broken the bones of nobles to forge an empire, now wrestled not with war, but with his own bladder. Peter had been many things: reformer, tyrant, visionary, butcher. He had towered over his people, both literally and figuratively, standing at 6'8", his shoulders broad as a soldier's gait. His eyes were sharp and restless, always seeking, always calculating. He learned carpentry in the Netherlands, dentistry in Vienna, and war in the trenches of Narva. He had cut off beards, rewritten laws, and renamed cities. He had made Russia modern, at a cost of uncountable lives and untold pain. But no matter how fiercely he ruled, his body was no more immune to weakness than any peasant's. The trouble began late in the previous year. Peter had waded into freezing water to help rescue a group of soldiers stranded by shifting ice near Lacta. The gesture was dramatic, noble even, but the cold penetrated deep, and the Tsar emerged shivering and pale. Soon after, he began experiencing sharp pains in his abdomen. He grew feverish, erratic, and prone to sudden outbursts. His doctors, ill-equipped and more concerned with his moods than his symptoms, prescribed purges, enemas, and bloodletting, medieval treatments that did nothing to address the growing crisis within. By early January, it was clear something was very wrong. Peter could no longer urinate without immense pain. His body swelled. His groans echoed down the marble halls of the Winter Palace. Servants wept outside his door, unable to help. His wife Catherine stood by him with quiet fury, watching as the physicians mumbled Latin and whispered among themselves. The Tsar's agony became unbearable. Some nights he would scream for hours, tearing at his robes, striking the bedposts, begging for relief. At times, he hallucinated. He spoke to dead generals, to ghosts of enemies long vanquished. Once he demanded his scepter, insisting he must ride to war against the Ottomans immediately. Another time, he seemed to see his mother scolding him for his impiety. The cause was a bladder blockage, almost certainly due to stones or an advanced infection. His urethra had narrowed, preventing the release of urine. With nowhere to go, the toxins spread through his body. His kidneys began to fail. His heart laboured under the strain. Desperate, the court summoned foreign doctors, Dutch, German, even an Italian surgeon who claimed to have operated on popes. But none could agree on a treatment. Surgery was too risky, and Peter, delirious with pain, refused to be bound. He thrashed and struck anyone who approached him with a scalpel. On January 27th, he managed one final act of clarity. He called for paper and pen and attempted to write a final will, but his hand trembled too violently. He scrawled only a few words, "Leave all to," and then the ink trailed off. He dropped the quill, stared at his hand as if it no longer belonged to him, and fell back into the bed, breathing in short, panicked gasps. That night, Peter the Great died in his chamber, soaked in sweat and tears, his body distended and discoloured. The giant of Russia, the Tsar who had once towered over Europe, died not with thunder nor applause, but choking on his own waste, poisoned from within. The palace fell into stunned silence. The succession was unclear. Catherine would be empress for a time, but the question of legacy hung heavier than the frost. How could a man so vast, so violent, so venerated, be defeated by something so undignified? Rumours spread. Some said it was syphilis, others claimed he had been cursed by the Orthodox Church for desecrating tradition. But those who had stood in his room, those who had heard the cries and smelled the sickness, knew the truth. It was his body, worn thin by excess and driven too hard by ambition, that had betrayed him. Peter was buried in the Peter and Paul fortress, entombed with regal ceremony. His face was painted serene, his body dressed in imperial robes, his hands crossed over his chest to hide the swelling. But no robe could hide the fact that this was not a warrior's death. It was the death of a man who had conquered everything but time, and whose final enemy had no face. And in another empire, far to the west, an emperor, beloved, exiled, mythic, would find his own strange end not on the battlefield, but among arsenic, wallpaper, and the long erosion of greatness behind gilded bars. The island of St. Helena, a speck of volcanic stone adrift in the vast South Atlantic, brooded under endless winds. Clouds clung low over its jagged hills, and the sea beat the cliffs with a rhythm as relentless as time. It was here, so far from the marble palaces of Europe, so far from the cannon smoke of Austerlitz and the whispers of Paris salons, that Napoleon Bonaparte, once Emperor of the French, walked a garden path in silence, stooped and fading, his glory buried under years and sky. Exile had not come gently. After Waterloo, after the abdication, after the pleas for asylum and the desperate flight, Britain had chosen the most remote punishment possible. St. Helena was isolated, wind-scoured and utterly inescapable. It was a prison without walls. And in that open cell, Napoleon dwindled not like a lion in chains, but like a man whose fire had been slowly and deliberately extinguished. His health began to fray in 1818. He complained of stomach pains, of fatigue, of a bitter taste that would not leave his mouth. The meals, prepared under British supervision, were always suspect. He feared poisoning. He whispered, sometimes to himself, that his captors sought to kill him slowly, that arsenic crept in the wallpaper, in the wine, even in the air. He was not entirely wrong. The walls of Longwood House, where he spent his last years, had been lined with bright green wallpaper dyed with Shields green, a pigment rich in arsenic. In the moist climate of the island, the pigment deteriorated, releasing toxic vapours. Each breath was laced with death. Day by day, molecule by molecule, he inhaled his undoing. He began to lose weight. His legs swelled, his gums bled. At times he could not stand without assistance. His famous appetite faded. The man who had once marched armies on foot for days could now scarcely leave his bed. And yet his mind remained sharp, defiant. He read voraciously, dictated memoirs, and argued with his British jailers over protocol, letters, and the proper way to pronounce honour. As the pain intensified, Napoleon grew suspicious of everyone, save for a few loyal companions. He accused his physician of incompetence, refused medicine, then demanded it. Some days he lay still for hours, his breath shallow and eyes fixed on the ceiling as if already rehearsing death. By early 1821, he could barely eat. Vomiting racked his body. His voice, once a battlefield trumpet, had become a thin rasp. On May 5th, during a storm that soaked the cliffs and lashed Longwood's shutters with Atlantic fury, he called for his priest. The room was dark, lit by flickering candlelight and the slow rhythm of rain on the roof. He asked for his son, though the boy was far away in Vienna, a pawn in another empire's game. He whispered words few could understand, fragments of Italian, Corsican, French. And then, near dusk, he muttered his last. France, army, head of the army. He died with no crown, no marble bed, no cannons to signal his passing. Only the wind bore witness, and the faces of a handful of servants who had once bowed to an emperor now wept over a dying man. The official cause of death was stomach cancer, common in his family and consistent with symptoms. But the mystery lingered. Years later, hair samples taken from his remains revealed high levels of arsenic, fueling speculation for generations. Was it the paint? Was it murder? Was it the slow revenge of an empire betrayed? The British buried him on the island in a grave marked only as Napoleon. No title, no dates, just a name, as if to strip him bare of everything he had once commanded. It would be 2 decades before France brought him home, reinterring his remains beneath the golden dome of Les Invalides, where tourists now walk past the polished sarcophagus and whisper of glory. Yet even there, beneath all the grandeur, the truth endures, that one of the greatest conquerors the world has ever known died vomiting blood alone, exiled, breathing poison in wallpaper and regret. He was not the first great man to die diminished, nor would he be the last. Far from the sea, in the green heart of England, another ruler, king not of empires, but of contradiction, would meet his end in a way that exposed the fragility of the human body in its most base and miserable form, seized not by war or treason, but by an affliction that struck while he sat, helpless, on the most private of thrones. In the quiet countryside of Berkshire, where hedgerows roll like soft waves and the sky wears its grey with pride, Windsor Castle loomed above the River Thames, old and sprawling, a crown of stone atop England's green brow. Within its walls in the late months of 1901, the rooms were hushed. Curtains were drawn, footsteps softened, and the world seemed to hold its breath. For inside, a monarch who had ruled for longer than many men had lived was nearing the end, not in war nor ceremony, but in the painful privacy of an ailment all too common and all too cruel. Queen Victoria had died that January, and now it was her son, Edward VII, who reigned, though briefly. But it is not his end we visit here. Instead, we step further back into the final days of her beloved husband, Prince Albert, who succumbed to a death still debated, still whispered about in corridors where royalty and illness meet. Prince Albert of Saxe, Coburg and Gotha had always been a man of discipline. He rose early, bathed in cold water, walked with stiff posture, and read the works of philosophers with a frown that seemed older than his years. He married Victoria in 1840, not merely as consort but as her advisor, her intellectual equal, and in many ways her restraint. While she burned with emotion and ceremony, he anchored her with logic, German precision and moral rigour. But in late 1861, something changed. Albert, just 42 years old, began to complain of fatigue. His appetite waned. He suffered from night sweats, fevers, and bouts of pain in the lower abdomen. Physicians called it gastric trouble, a vague phrase covering everything from indigestion to deep hidden disease. Some said it was stress. He had been involved in a political scandal, accused of meddling in state matters. Others said it was grief, for his eldest son had recently been embroiled in an affair that shamed the family. But the true cause was more bodily than political. By mid-December, Albert could scarcely leave his bed. He winced when touched. He lay beneath heavy blankets, pale as parchment, his breathing shallow, his skin clammy. The doctors, armed with stethoscopes and leeches, tonics and false confidence, diagnosed him with typhoid fever, a common and often fatal affliction in the age before antibiotics. But as his suffering worsened, another theory emerged, one never publicly confirmed in his lifetime. That Albert had been suffering not from typhoid, but from colorectal cancer or Crohn's disease, something slower, something that gnawed from within over years. For weeks he had been unable to pass waste properly. The pain had become unbearable. He had collapsed in the water closet more than once, drenched in sweat, sobbing not from fear, but from humiliation. The royal staff tried to preserve dignity. They whispered orders. They replaced servants who wept too visibly. But nothing could hide the truth. The prince consort, the moral compass of the monarchy, was dying 1 inch at a time, struck down by a disease that made even the act of sitting unbearable. On December 14, 1861, Albert died at Windsor, surrounded by the heavy scent of violets and the stifling press of drapery. Queen Victoria, devastated beyond words, never fully recovered. She wore mourning black for the rest of her life. She ordered his rooms preserved exactly as they had been, his shaving brush, his books, even his chamber pot discreetly cleaned and tucked beneath a dressing table. She called him my angel, and in her journals described his death as peaceful, as if he had simply fallen asleep. But others knew better. The palace had worked tirelessly to soften the image, to ensure that the final hours of the prince who had helped reshape the British monarchy would not be remembered for the grim details of waste, weakness and failed function. Yet the story lingered in private, among those who served him, among physicians who whispered in Latin behind closed doors. It was not a noble death. It was a death of the flesh, of decay, of the embarrassing functions we all share, rendered all the more striking by the crown that hung so near. Albert's funeral was conducted with pomp and pageantry. He was buried in the royal mausoleum at Frogmore, his likeness carved in marble, his brow serene, hands folded as if in sleep. But somewhere in the folds of that endless black mourning gown, Victoria carried the memory of how it had really ended. And as the British Empire marched on, a young king across the Channel would one day meet his own absurd demise, not in bed, not in agony, but in the throes of defiance against medicine, against caution, and against the very walls of his dining hall. In the heart of Bavaria, where lakes mirror the mountains and palaces shimmer like fantasies frozen in time, a young monarch once reigned in twilight. Ludwig II, King of Bavaria, was a dreamer, a king born not for courts and councils, but for moonlit balconies, myth and music. He built castles that seemed torn from the pages of legend, Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee, each a monument not to power, but to longing. Yet the very soul that raised towers toward the stars could not save him from the cold, black water that would one day swallow him whole. He had come to the throne at 18, awkward and shy, more at home in operas than war rooms. He idolized Richard Wagner, lavished him with patronage, and surrounded himself with beauty and solitude. His court grew uneasy. Ministers muttered of his eccentricities, his nocturnal walks, his obsession with fairy tales, his distaste for politics. He became known as the fairy tale king, a ruler whose crown rested not on iron, but on snow and silence. But Bavaria was not a fairy tale. The costs of his architectural dreams ballooned. His castles consumed fortunes. His distance from governance became dangerous. By 1886, his ministers had had enough. They declared him insane, though few had truly examined him. A panel of doctors, assembled in secrecy, signed the order for his removal. Ludwig, the king of castles, was to be deposed, not in war, not by rebellion, but by diagnosis. They came for him on June 10th, surrounding Neuschwanstein like shadows pressing against stained glass. He was stunned, betrayed, and quietly furious. He submitted without a fight, escorted to Berg Castle on the shores of Lake Starnberg. His cousin, Prince Luitpold, assumed regency. The fairy tale had ended, or so they thought. 3 days later, on the evening of June 13th, Ludwig went for a walk. His attending physician, Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, accompanied him. The air was still, the sky heavy. The waters of the lake glinted like dark silk, quiet as a secret. They did not return. When servants searched the shore that night, they found nothing. By morning, the truth surfaced. 2 bodies floating in the shallows. The king's face was pale, his moustache stiff with lake water. His coat weighed heavy on his limbs. Von Gudden lay nearby, his head bruised, eyes wide in final protest. The official report said drowning. No water in the king's lungs, they said. He had died quickly. But others weren't so sure. He was an excellent swimmer. There were bruises on his body. No autopsy was performed. Whispers began immediately. Had he tried to escape? Did von Gudden attempt to stop him? Had the king struck him only to fall himself in despair? Or was it murder, an execution in still water, ordered by those who feared a restoration? The royal court buried the questions with the bodies. Ludwig was laid to rest in Munich, amid candles and chorales. His castles were opened to the public, their staircases echoing with the footsteps of those who had once mocked their cost. And slowly over the years, the mad king became something more, beloved, mourned, mythologized. They remembered his eyes, blue and distant. They remembered his long walks, his voice when he spoke of Parsifal and lost kingdoms. They remembered a man who never fit the crown he wore, and who in the end seemed to vanish into his own story, like a ghost stepping into mist. Lake Starnberg remains still. The trees along the shore lean inward, as if listening, and every June roses appear near the spot where 2 men vanished into silence. No plaque, no guardrail, just the lapping water and the wind. Not all kings die in battle, some slip beneath the surface. And across the world, beneath the orange banners of imperial China, another sovereign, equally burdened by isolation and ritual, would one day meet his fate behind lacquered doors, betrayed not by others, but by a golden potion offered in hope and swallowed in vain. The Forbidden City, vast and inscrutable, lay at the center of Beijing like a coiled dragon, its golden roofs shimmering under layers of coal smoke and incense, its courtyards echoing with footsteps that never rushed, and its chambers heavy with history too ancient to name aloud. Here, behind vermilion walls and silken screens, emperors were born, crowned, and often broken. Among them, Guangxu, the ill-fated son of heaven, would perish not by sword or rebellion, but by a sip of something precious, something offered as salvation and swallowed as death. He was born in 1871, a child plucked by Empress Dowager Cixi from the imperial clan to serve as emperor after the death of the Tongji emperor. At just 4 years old, Guangxu was crowned, lifted high upon the dragon throne by hands far more powerful than his own. He ruled in name, but it was Cixi, the Iron Widow, the Shadow Sovereign, who held the reins. As he grew older, the emperor chafed beneath her control. He was shy, bookish, often sickly, but he possessed a stubborn streak and a desire to see China stand once more with pride before the world. In the 1890s, as foreign powers carved the Qing Empire into spheres of influence, Guangxu launched the 100 Days Reform, a sweeping attempt to modernize governance, education, the military, and more. It lasted barely 3 months. Conservatives led by Cixi struck back with swift precision. The emperor was placed under house arrest. His loyalists were executed, his edicts nullified, and so he remained for a decade, imprisoned not in chains but in the deepest silken stillness of the Forbidden City. His quarters overlooked a garden he was no longer allowed to walk. His meals were tested, his letters intercepted, and even his attendants were chosen by those loyal to the dowager. Once the master of 10,000 years, Guangxu became a ghost in yellow robes, pacing the same stone paths, whispering poems to the koi fish who darted in the lotus ponds. He aged before his time. His health declined. His skin grew pale, his back hunched, and a persistent cough gnawed at him like guilt. But he endured, as the empire he once sought to save crumbled beyond the walls. The Boxer Rebellion came and went. Foreign soldiers marched through the gates. Treaties bled the nation dry. And still Guangxu lingered, his life a flickering candle watched by eyes that no longer hid their impatience. On November 14th, 1908, news swept the palace. The Empress Dowager Cixi was dying. The dragon throne would soon pass to a child, Puyi, chosen by her as her final act. But before the old empress could release her final breath, the matter of the emperor had to be resolved. She could not risk Guangxu returning to power, and so in the shadow of her deathbed, a final decision was made. The next day, Guangxu was dead. His death was quiet and at first unremarked. Officially, it was declared natural causes, a frail body finally surrendering to years of sorrow and confinement. But those who had seen him in his final hours whispered otherwise. His lips had turned black, his fingernails had darkened, he had vomited blood. There had been no fever, no sign of struggle, only the unmistakable calm of poisoning. Rumours swirled. Arsenic slipped into a tonic. A golden elixir, laced with medicine and betrayal. Some believed it had been administered by a eunuch, others that it came in the guise of healing from a loyal servant turned agent of Cixi's will. Whatever the method, the motive was clear to prevent him from ever ruling again. A century later, forensic analysis of his remains confirmed the truth. His hair and bones bore traces of arsenic at levels hundreds of times higher than normal. Guangxu had been murdered. And so the emperor, who had once dreamed of trains, universities, and a stronger China, died not in battle, not even in disgrace, but in invisible agony. His last hours stripped of dignity, his final thoughts likely clouded not with revenge, but resignation. His body was interred in the Western King tombs, near the dust of others whose names still echo in dragon script. His murderer died the following day, and the empire, already teetering, would collapse within 4 years. Among the chrysanthemums and red pavilions of the palace garden, the wind still moves as it always has, delicate, persistent, knowing. It remembers. It carries, even now, the scent of tea, old lacquer, and something bitter beneath it. Something that once burned in the throat of an emperor who died with his back straight, his lips sealed, and the taste of empire fading into ash. In another court, far west across the sands and oceans, a very different ruler, one of bravado, feasting, and unchecked appetite, would meet his end at the height of indulgence, as his body, bloated with conquest and pride, finally turned against itself in the most ignoble fashion. The halls of Babylon shimmered beneath a sun so fierce it seemed to bleach even the memory of rain. Columns carved with lions and dragons stood watch over streets of baked brick, and gardens hung in defiance of gravity, flowing with green above a world of conquest and dust. It was here, or so the chroniclers believed, that Alexander III of Macedon, called the Great, the world's conqueror, met his end not on the battlefield, not in a blaze of sword and glory, but in a room stinking of sickness, shadowed with silence, as his own body betrayed the godlike myth he had so carefully forged. He had conquered the known world. From the plains of Caronia to the edges of the Indus River, Alexander had swept through empires like a firestorm. He toppled Darius of Persia. He crossed mountains thought impassable. He founded cities in his name and was worshipped as a living deity in lands where his tongue was never heard. Yet at the height of his power, at just 32 years old, the King of Kings lay paralyzed in a palace, unable to speak, unable to move, surrounded by generals who whispered and physicians who trembled. It began, as these things so often do, with a feast. June in Babylon was a furnace. The air itself seemed to burn. But Alexander, ever restless, had summoned his companions to a banquet, a celebration perhaps, or a ritual offering before a campaign into Arabia. Wine flowed like river water. Roasted meats, honeyed fruits, and rare spices filled the chamber with an aroma both intoxicating and overwhelming. He drank deeply, always had. His constitution, once mighty, had been wearied by years of wounds, travel, and excess. That night, after a particularly large cup, he cried out in pain. Not the pain of headache or heartburn, but something deeper, sharper, like a blade twisting behind the ribs. He left the feast, gripping his side, and collapsed into bed. For days he burned. The fever rose like a tide that would not turn back. He sweated through his sheets. He lost the strength to rise. He stopped eating. His breath grew shallow. The court was paralyzed. No man dared say what all were thinking, that the immortal was dying. He summoned his officers one by one. Though his voice was faint, he managed to speak, to press hands, to offer glances that seemed like final commands. When asked to whom he would leave his empire, he whispered, or so the tale goes, to the strongest. By the 10th day he could no longer speak. His body swelled, his skin turned grey, his eyes, once bright as cut steel, dulled to glass. Some say he lay fully paralyzed, trapped in his mind, hearing every word spoken around him, hearing the soldiers sob, the priests chant, the generals plot, a living death. After 12 days he stopped breathing. But here the story twists. For even in death, Alexander defied nature. His body did not decay, not for days, no bloating, no rot, no odour. The embalmers arrived expecting putrefaction, but found instead a corpse as cold and untouched as marble. Some took it as proof of divinity. Others, now with modern eyes, believe it may point to another truth, that he was not dead at all, that he had suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome or another rare paralysis, leaving him locked in a prison of flesh as the world mourned him alive. It is a possibility so horrifying that even time dares not dwell on it long. His body was eventually embalmed and placed in a golden sarcophagus, carried across deserts and rivers, fought over by men who had once knelt at his feet. His tomb became legend, his resting place a mystery. Alexandria in Egypt became his shrine, but in time even that vanished beneath centuries of conquest and sand. What remains is this: a man who built an empire of dreams and died in sweat-soaked sheets, choking on breath he could not control, with eyes staring at a ceiling he would never rise beneath again. And far to the northwest in the red-tiled courtyards of Rome, a different ruler, glutted not on dreams but on dinners, would meet a similar fate, his hunger never satisfied, his death a grotesque mirror of his appetite. As if the very gods he sought to please decided to serve him one final fatal course. The marble halls of imperial Rome echoed with laughter, oil lamps flickering against painted ceilings, and the scent of roasted meats and honeyed wine clinging to every tapestry and toga. Feasts were not mere meals, they were declarations of power, orchestrations of indulgence, and in some cases slow, sumptuous suicides. Among the emperors who walked these gilded corridors, none was more devoted to his own excess than Claudius, or so history records. But it would be his heir, Claudius's adopted son and step-grandson, who died not in grand spectacle, but slumped in a chair too full to breathe, undone by the very luxury he had always demanded. Claudius, for his part, met his end by poison, discreet and political. Nero by his own hand in dramatic shame. But it was another lesser-remembered emperor, one who craved no operas, who waged no wars of poetry, who perished in such base fashion that even Rome, master of spectacle, found it grotesquely fitting. That man was Valentinian VI, though some confuse him with others. Over centuries, the tales of gluttonous deaths have woven together into a tapestry of absurdity. And so, in retelling this tale, one finds a strange blend of legend and truth, rooted perhaps most famously in the death of the Emperor Jovian, or even more so of the later Emperor Galerius, who was said to have died not by sword, but by the slow collapse of his body under the weight of his own appetites. Galerius had been a soldier, a fierce and able man once, rising from humble stock to command legions. But with power came corruption, not only of the state, but of the self. He became fond of the table, meats spiced beyond reason, eels soaked in wine, sauces thick with goat's milk and garum. His meals stretched into hours. He laughed with his mouth full, drank until his face turned purple, and rewarded his cooks with villas for concocting dishes that confounded even the most jaded palates. By the time he was in his 50s, his body had begun to revolt. His legs swelled. His breath grew short after only a few steps. Still, he refused to slow. "I am the Empire," he reportedly said, "and the Empire shall eat." And so it did. The night of his death, the palace kitchen in Nicomedia prepared what some called the Feast of Saturn, a celebration of Rome's pagan past, defiant in the face of rising Christianity. Dozens of dishes were served, larks stuffed with nuts and cheese, sea urchins steamed in wine, flamingo tongues dusted with saffron. Galerius, swollen and wheezing, devoured each one. He drank from chalices larger than his own helmet. He laughed, slapped his belly, and ordered more. Then, as he reached for a dish of honey-roasted dormice, his hand trembled. He paused, blinked, and let out a strange noise, not a burp, not a gasp, but something between them. His mouth sagged open. He tried to speak, but his tongue seemed too large, his throat too narrow. He reached for the edge of the table, missed, and tumbled backward. There was no battle cry, no imperial edict, only the crash of silver dishes, the shattering of a goblet, and the thud of flesh against marble. Servants rushed to lift him. He vomited once, violently, then again, then blood followed. Some say he tore at his own robe, as if trying to free his distended stomach from its silken prison. Others claimed he died with a smile, content. He did not die quickly. For hours he lingered. Physicians tried bleeding him, rubbing crushed herbs on his chest, forcing potions between clenched teeth. But his body, already failing, had been pushed beyond the brink. His belly was so swollen that even the act of breathing became a siege. At last, before dawn, he expired, his face purple, his eyes glassy, his lips still stained with wine. The imperial court did what courts always do. They dressed the death in dignity. They said it was fever. They said he died peacefully in his sleep, his last words praising Rome. But the soldiers who guarded his chamber knew. The slaves who carried away the soiled linens knew. The cooks, trembling in the cold kitchens, knew. Rome had devoured itself through the mouth of one man. His body was entombed in a stone sarcophagus carved with scenes of conquest, though none dared carve the final scene. And the empire, already stretched thin, would not last many more generations. Perhaps Galerius's death was a warning. Or perhaps it was simply Roman to the last, opulent, excessive, and spectacularly absurd. And far away, in a misty kingdom of oaths and blades, another monarch, warrior and lover both, would meet a fate no less tragic. Cut down not by battle nor disease, but by the betrayal of his own spine, as it shattered on the tilting back of a wooden throne. The moors of England sighed under a damp twilight sky, their heather-coloured hills rolling endlessly toward a horizon dusted with smoke from hearths and iron forges. Castles dotted the landscape like forgotten gods, each holding centuries of loyalty, treason, and quiet death. Among them Winchester once stood tall in both majesty and menace, echoing with the whispers of kings long past. It was here, in the early 12th century, that King William II, known as William Rufus for the ruddy flush of his cheeks, met his end in a manner that still stirs unease. But his tale was not the only one of its kind. Centuries later, another English sovereign would die in a way more humiliating, more absurd, and far less recorded in solemn script. That king was Edward II. Edward, son of the famed Edward I, had been crowned with high expectations. His father had conquered Wales, stood tall against the Scots, and built castles like thunderheads. But the son was of a different mould, softer, more poetic, drawn not to war but to art, pageantry, and the intimate companionship of men whose names the court dared not speak too loudly. From the beginning his reign was beset by crisis. His favouritism toward Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight of undeniable charm, incited fury among the barons. His military failures in Scotland, most notably the humiliating defeat at Bannockburn in 1314, left the kingdom weakened and his own reputation in tatters. Yet it was not a sword on the battlefield that would fell him, nor a cup of poison slipped by schemers. It was the long, painful erosion of power that led him to a place of splinters, straw, and darkness. After years of revolt and civil war, his wife, Queen Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, seized the crown through quiet terror. Edward was deposed and imprisoned, eventually confined in Berkeley Castle, where his guards were said to take pleasure in tormenting the fallen king. There the winds whispered through the arrow slits and the stone grew colder by the day. No longer a ruler, he was reduced to a prisoner without dignity, a shadow of royalty haunted by the silence of betrayal. But it was not his deposition that etched his death into the pages of grotesque legend. It was the method. According to one chronicler, an account whispered in both fear and fascination, His jailers, seeking to avoid any visible injury that might enrage his still loyal supporters, employed a death so cruel, so calculated in its shame, that it bordered on myth. They restrained him, lit a brazier, and heated a long, narrow iron. Then, through a funnel and horn, they inserted the instrument into his rectum, burning him from within. The screams, it is said, could be heard far beyond the castle walls, drowned only by the howls of hunting dogs loosed in the courtyard to mask the sound. Whether this method was used, or whether he died of starvation or sickness, remains unknown. But the tale persisted. It gripped the medieval imagination and became the grotesque punctuation on a reign marked by failure and scandal. But that was not the final absurdity to stain the legacy of a king in England. There was another tale far less known, hidden among the folds of dusty chronicles and spoken only with unease, that of Henry I, son of William the Conqueror, and a man of discipline, scholarship, and a deep love for roasted lampreys. Henry had ruled long and effectively, balancing tyranny and law with calculated brilliance. He outlived his rivals, crushed rebellion, and imposed order on a kingdom long accustomed to chaos. But he had one weakness, a fatal fondness for the slippery, eel-like delicacy known as lamprey. In 1135, during a hunting retreat in Normandy, Henry sat down to a lavish meal. Despite warnings from his physicians who cautioned against his overindulgence, he consumed an enormous quantity of lampreys stewed in wine and spices. The fish, rich and oily, was considered dangerous in excess, a risk to digestion and blood. Henry, as always, ignored caution. Within hours, he fell violently ill. He doubled over in pain. His bowels turned to water. He vomited until blood streaked his beard. Despite the best efforts of his physicians, who administered purgatives, leeches, and prayers, his condition worsened. His abdomen swelled grotesquely, his face turned a sickly grey, and by the following night, he was dead. The official cause was a surfeit of lampreys, an overindulgence in a food so luxuriously loathsome that even his enemies whispered of it with pity. Thus, the king who had ruled with precision and might, who had expanded the royal bureaucracy and enforced Norman control with iron logic, died because he could not resist one more bite of eel. His body, bloated and foul, was carried to Reading Abbey. It was said the corpse was so putrid that it had to be eviscerated and embalmed hastily. His entrails were buried in Normandy, while the rest of his remains were sealed in lead and transported across the Channel. Monks gagged, horses refused to carry the bier, and still the stench of death followed. Not a battlefield, not a dagger, but dinner, a sovereign undone by his appetite. And beyond England, in the gold-drenched deserts of Africa, another king would someday fall. Not through battle or banquet, but in an incident so ridiculous it would be passed down in quiet shame, involving a camel, a royal robe, and a wind too strong to be denied. The sands of Timbuktu swirled like whispers, fine as flour, drifting through alleyways carved from sun-baked mud and memories. Beneath its earthen towers and manuscript-laden mosques, the heart of the Malian Empire once pulsed with gold, wisdom, and rhythm. Trade caravans snaked across the Sahara like slow, determined rivers, bringing silk, salt, and secrets. And within this empire, among the richest the world had ever known, lived a king whose death would be remembered not for its majesty, but for the absurdity that clung to it like dust on silk. King Uli II of Mali, successor to the famed Mansa Musa, was not a ruler of legend, but of unfortunate misstep. Unlike his predecessor, whose Hajj to Mecca with a procession of elephants and mountains of gold nearly toppled economies, Uli was quieter, more reserved, ruling during a time of relative peace and prosperity. He was a thoughtful man, if not a charismatic one, and he took comfort in the slow cycles of empire. Taxes gathered, trade routes patrolled, prayers echoed at dawn. But he was also fond of ceremony, of processions through the desert, and of appearing regal before his people with all the splendor of his station, gold-threaded robes, incense burning from the saddle, peacock feathers swaying in the breeze. On one such day, as part of a grand tribute to ancestors and spirits, Uli ordered a royal parade through the outskirts of the Sahel. The air was thick with drums and the smell of myrrh. The nobles rode with gleaming swords, and before them marched scribes carrying tablets inscribed with praises. At the centre of it all, astride a towering dromedary, rode Uli II. He wore a great cloak dyed the deepest crimson, stitched with silver talismans trailing yards behind him. His headdress was adorned with ostrich plumes, catching every gust. The camel, high-stepping and ornery, had been selected for its majesty, its neck long and curved like a bow, its eyes outlined in black coal. But camels, though proud, are not always predictable. As they crossed a wide dune, the wind shifted. A great gust roared from the north, lifting sand and shawls alike. The king's cloak, lightened by the thinness of its weave and the weight of its embroidery, caught the wind like a sail. It billowed out behind him, first gently, then violently. Startled by the sudden tug, the camel reared. The motion snapped the king backward. Uli, seated atop a high ceremonial saddle with no true support, was flung from his perch, but he did not fall cleanly. The cloak, caught in the gilded hooks of the saddle, twisted around his throat as he fell. In one surreal moment, the wind, the camel, and the robe conspired. His body hung, briefly suspended, the neck twisted, eyes wide in shock. By the time the handlers reached him, he was dangling, motionless, choked by his own regalia. The procession halted. Drums stopped. A silence unlike any other fell over the desert. They cut him down gently, but it was too late. The healers whispered prayers. Some tried to hide the nature of his death, covering his neck with golden scarves, suggesting he had fainted from heat. But word spread quickly, for no tragedy as bizarre could be silenced for long. The king had been strangled by his own cloak. His funeral was swift, wrapped in solemn chants and lined with incense thick enough to obscure the truth. But the people remembered. They spoke of the spirit winds, jealous of the king's pride. Others blamed the camel, saying it had been cursed. And in every market from Gao to Jen, the tale shifted, sometimes comical, sometimes pitiful, always strange. In time, his death became proverb. Even a king may choke on silk. His successor, more cautious, outlawed cloaks longer than 2 paces during all royal ceremonies. Camels used for parades were henceforth trained not just for discipline, but for silence. And the dunes, ever shifting, soon buried the very spot where the wind once claimed a crown. Far away across the cold seas and storm-thrashed cliffs of the north, another monarch would meet his own end, not by camel or cloak, but by the failure of a feast he did not even taste, where rotten meat, ill-kept secrets, and a banquet hall full of hollow smiles would deliver the final blow. The hall at Stirling Castle was draped in banners of gold and blue, and its long tables were laid with silver platters, goblets of carved horn, and meat still steaming from the kitchens. The scent of venison stew mingled with roasted boar and barley bread, while minstrels strummed quietly near the stone hearth. Outside, the Scottish hills rolled under a bruised twilight sky, and the wind carried the scent of peat smoke and rain. Inside, however, there was cheer, for the court had gathered to honour a king long shadowed by war, betrayal and illness, James I of Scotland. James had survived much. Born in 1394, captured as a boy by the English, and held for nearly 2 decades, he returned to Scotland hardened and cunning. His rule was marked by attempts to reform the nobility, to strengthen royal power, to pull Scotland from the claws of chaos. But power, when wielded too boldly, has a way of gathering enemies. In February of 1437, James and his queen, Joan Beaufort, took residence at the Blackfriars Monastery in Perth, a quieter place, safer, they believed, distant from the political fires that had grown too hot in Edinburgh. It was meant to be a retreat, a rest. But the court, ever watchful, had heard whispers of nobles displeased with the king's harsh hand, of plots forming in the mist, and behind one name all the murmurs gathered. Sir Robert Graham, a man who had once served James but now seethed with vengeance after the imprisonment of his kinsman. On the night of February 20th, while the king prepared for bed, the conspirators acted. The doors of the monastery were thrown open. Guards, either absent or bribed, did not stop them. They came with daggers and wrath, their faces masked, their steps muffled by the thick stone corridors. Hearing the noise, James leapt from his bed. He knew death was coming. The story that follows is grotesque, tragic, and almost surreal. In his panic, the king sought escape, rushing barefoot across the flagstones to a small chamber, the royal latrine, a narrow closet-like room with a privy shaft that emptied into the monastery's drainage system below. Desperate, he pried up the wooden boards beneath the stool and slid his body down into the foul-smelling tunnel, hoping to hide in the darkness among waste and stone. It was a plan born of desperation and absurdity. But fate was not finished. Days earlier, James had ordered the escape tunnel beneath the latrine to be sealed, to prevent tennis balls from rolling under the floor, of all things. The opening had been blocked with stone. Now, as he pressed himself into the space, he found it closed. He was trapped in the filth, pressed against the cold masonry, his breath shallow, the reek of rot and old water rising into his nostrils. The assassins found the room moments later. They searched, puzzled, until one of them noticed something, perhaps a stain of blood on the stone, or the faint sound of breath from below. They tore up the floorboards, saw the king crouched in the darkness, and dragged him upward by his arms, filthy and terrified. There was no mercy. They stabbed him over and over. Some say more than 20 times, others say 30. His cries echoed through the monastery. His queen, just rooms away, tried to reach him but was forced back by the attackers. By the time it ended, James's body was barely recognizable. The next morning, the sun rose over a Scotland without its king. In the aftermath, Queen Joan ordered swift vengeance. The conspirators were hunted, captured, and executed with a cruelty to rival the murder itself. Robert Graham was torn apart by red-hot pincers. But the shame of how James had died, crouched in a cesspit, trying to flee through a sewer, could not be undone. Whispers spread quickly. In taverns, they told the tale with a twisted grin. The king who hid in his own latrine, who blocked his only escape to preserve a game. It became metaphor, warning, jest. A king undone by the very walls he built. And somewhere in the hills, the wind passed over the monastery ruins, through the moss and ivy, through the empty shaft where once a monarch had huddled in filth, waiting for mercy that never came. Across the sea, in a colder palace lined with icicles and brocade, another ruler, this one of ancient lineage and violent legacy, would soon meet his death, not with blood or blade, but on the icy surface of a river he once ruled, as the frozen world beneath him cracked like prophecy. The Neva River in winter lay silent beneath a sky of lead, frozen thick and gleaming like a sheet of glass dragged over the underworld. St. Petersburg, imperial and cold, watched from its banks, its domes and palaces glazed in frost, its streets muffled under snow. In such a season, even time itself seemed to hesitate. And it was there, amid the stillness of ice and the emptiness of a royal promenade, that Tsar Paul I of Russia would meet the strange, humiliating end of a reign that had begun in paranoia and ended in farce. Paul had always been the shadow behind his mother, Catherine the Great. For most of his life, he was heir in waiting, but never truly trusted. Catherine did not name him successor, considering even the possibility of passing the crown directly to his son, Alexander. She saw Paul as unstable, obsessive and erratic, traits that would one day prove prophetic. When she died suddenly in 1796, Paul finally became emperor. But decades of being held at arm's length had warped him. His rule unfolded like a fever dream. He reversed his mother's reforms with manic urgency. He issued edicts at dawn and rescinded them by dusk. He obsessed over military uniforms, demanding that soldiers change their dress codes so often that some were flogged for failing to keep up. He enforced discipline so harshly that even whispers against him became acts of sedition. But his greatest obsession was control. He distrusted the nobility, the military, the court, and even his own guards. He slept in different rooms each night. He forbade the mention of Catherine's name, and he surrounded himself with a small circle of flatterers who dared not question the delusions that guided his every decree. The tension within the palace thickened like ice before a break. By 1801, a conspiracy had formed among high-ranking officers and nobles, including General Bennigsen and even the Tsar's own son, Alexander. They could not allow Paul's paranoia to continue its spiral, and so, in the final days of March, they prepared for a bloodless coup. They hoped only to detain him, to force abdication. But history rarely bends to gentle plans. On the night of March 23rd, in St. Michael's Castle, Paul dined alone, brooding over reports of French aggression. Snow whispered against the windows. The torches outside flickered in the wind. He dismissed his servants and retired to his chamber, one of many he used in rotation to thwart imagined assassins. As he undressed, the doors burst open. A group of officers entered, some drunk, some trembling. Paul recognized them. He had trusted many of them once. He demanded to know what they were doing. They told him he was under arrest. He refused. He shouted. He lunged for a sword. Chaos erupted. The details differ, blurred by fear and shame. Some say he was struck with a snuff box, others with a sword hilt. He fell to the floor. One officer tried to restrain him with a sash. Another, in the heat of panic, wrapped a scarf around his neck and pulled. In the end, Paul I, Emperor of all the Russias, died on the floor of his own chamber, strangled with a silk sash, perhaps his own, perhaps not. His face pressed into a floor that still bore the warmth of his footsteps. The conspirators fled into the frozen night, dragging their breath like fugitives. By morning, Alexander had been proclaimed Tsar, and the death was declared natural. But no one believed it. And the people, long fearful of Paul's madness, sighed not in mourning, but in uneasy relief. Yet one final insult remained. Paul, for all his paranoia, had built his grand castle, St. Michael's, not as a palace of pleasure, but as a fortress, surrounded by moats and guarded by high walls. He believed he could not be reached there, could not be touched by treason. He was murdered in the very room he thought safest. The ice on the Neva thickened that year. Some said it did not thaw properly until summer, as if the river itself had swallowed the secret of the emperor's death and refused to let it melt. And far across the old world, in a damp court where red bricks met northern skies, another sovereign, less mighty, more tragic, would fall not to violence or conspiracy, but to a staircase and the quiet betrayal of an aging body, in a moment both ridiculous and unbearably human. The chill of London never truly left the bones, even in the spring. It crept through the narrow alleys of Kensington, wound around gas lamps in the fog, and seeped into the very brickwork of the royal residences. In Kensington Palace, red and sombre, a sovereign once so full of promise moved through its rooms like a ghost, bowed not by grief or scandal, but by illness and the slow, humiliating undoing of her own body. Her name was Queen Anne, and her death was not a fool in battle or a victim of betrayal, but a slow collapse crowned by one final indignity, a staircase too steep and legs that could no longer bear a queen. Anne had come to the throne in 1702, the last of the Stuarts, uniting England and Scotland under one crown. Her reign was marked by war, the rise of political parties and the blossoming of empire. But behind the glittering surface of parliament and power, her life was a quiet tragedy. She had endured at least 17 pregnancies, miscarriages, stillbirths, infants who died within days. Of all her children, only one, Prince William, lived beyond infancy. He died at 11. The loss left Anne hollowed. She grieved not with tears, but with silence and prayer, her body and spirit equally scarred. By her 40s, she was plagued by gout, obesity, and constant pain. Her legs were swollen, her hands twisted, her breath laboured. She was carried to meetings of state in a sedan chair, her flesh too tender to bear the weight of her own crown. Still, she ruled, signing documents, issuing orders, struggling to keep the Union and her cabinet from breaking apart like her own joints. In the summer of 1714, her condition worsened. She slept little. Her speech slurred. The physicians, baffled, prescribed everything from opium to mercury. She developed a massive swelling in her legs and abdomen. Her appetite faded. Her mind began to drift. But it was not fever or delirium that would strike the final blow. It was a moment so absurd in its simplicity that the court hushed it from the records. On July 30th, Anne rose from her bed with assistance. She insisted, against the advice of her ladies, that she descend the private staircase from her chamber to the morning room below. She wished to watch the garden one last time, she said, to feel the light. 2 footmen supported her. Her frame was draped in heavy velvet, embroidered with mourning black. Step by step, they began the descent. Halfway down, her knee buckled. The footmen, caught off guard, lost their grip. The Queen stumbled. Her heel caught the edge of her gown. She fell, not far, but far enough. She landed awkwardly, her ankle twisting, her back striking the marble banister. There was a sickening sound, muffled only by the velvet that wrapped her. Silence followed. She was lifted, barely conscious, and returned to her bed. Her ankle was shattered, her spine likely fractured. The shock sent her into a deeper decline. She no longer spoke. Her hands grew cold. She drifted in and out of awareness, whispering only names of children long buried, of friends now ghosts. On the morning of August 1st, she died. The room was darkened. The court stood in grim silence. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows, as if too polite to intrude on her passing. They said it was a stroke. They said it was the culmination of illness and exhaustion. But behind closed doors, the truth was whispered. The Queen had fallen, not in rebellion, not in glory, but on the stairs of her own palace, her body too swollen to rise, her spirit already far ahead of her. She was buried in Westminster Abbey beside her husband and the empty spaces meant for the children who had never grown. Her reign faded into history, often overlooked between the triumphs of Elizabeth and the splendour of Victoria. But her story remained, quiet and aching, beneath the stone. And in the far reaches of the east, beyond forests and rivers where nomads rode like thunder, another ruler, a Khan, mighty and untouchable, would one day be claimed not by sword or sickness, but by the accident of a fall from his horse, a wound in the wrong place, and a death he refused to admit until the end. The steppes of Central Asia stretched endlessly, rolling in gold and smoke beneath a sky that bore down like an open eye. Wind swept the grasslands with a whisper that had no origin and no end, and hooves beat the earth like war drums beneath riders who answered to no flag but conquest. From these boundless plains had risen a man so feared, so mythic, that even in death, the earth itself seemed unwilling to speak his name aloud. Genghis Khan, Temujin of the Borjigin, scourge of empires, storm on horseback, died not in battle, but in a fall, sudden and cruel, far from the glory that had built him into legend. He had conquered more than any man before him. From the edges of the Caspian Sea to the mountains of northern China, his empire stretched like a wound across the known world. Cities burned in his wake. Rivers were dyed with blood. But for all the violence and vengeance, he had forged a unity that no steppe lord had ever dreamed, an empire of law, trade, and whispered fear. By the year 1227, he was aging, though no one dared speak it. His eyes were not as sharp, his bones not as quick, but his will remained iron. He had taken a Tangut rebellion as a personal insult, and so he rode with his armies deep into the western mountains, determined to crush every last defiant voice. His warriors followed without question. The earth trembled beneath them. And then it happened. The details are few, veiled in contradiction and silence. Some say he fell from his horse during a hunt, alone, the animal spooked by a marmot or a shifting wind. Others claim he was thrown in battle, tangled in the chaos of retreating enemy forces. One legend whispers that a captured princess, gifted to him as tribute, hid a small blade and struck him in the groin during the night. Whatever the cause, the wound was grave. His attendants found him pale, clutching his abdomen, blood soaking into his robes. He was rushed to his ger, a tent hung with felt and fur, a palace of mobility, and laid on thick cushions beneath the scent of smoke and pine. He ordered silence. No word of his injury was to leave the camp. He ruled through fear, and fear must not fade. For days he lingered. He issued commands. He dictated terms of vengeance. His voice, though hoarse, carried the weight of empires. But his body betrayed him. The wound festered. Fever set in. His breath became shallow. His sons and generals gathered, grim-faced, speaking in whispers. He summoned them one by one, bestowing final commands, some brutal, some wise, all absolute. On the night of August 18, 1227, beneath a moon pale as bone, Genghis Khan died. There was no fanfare, no pyre, no tomb for the world to find. His body was taken in secret by his most loyal guards, buried in an unmarked grave. The river was said to have been diverted over the spot to conceal it forever. Trees planted, horses trampled the earth. Those who carried the body were slain, and then those who slew them. Silence became his mausoleum. But the tale of his death did not vanish, it twisted. Some claimed he had died in bed, old and peaceful, a patriarch returning to the wind. Others insisted he had been poisoned. A few whispered of the woman's blade, and that the great Khan had bled out in the dark, his eyes wide with shock, not pain. Yet the most enduring, the most quietly mourned version remained the simplest, that he fell. That the man who had crushed cities with a glance was undone by gravity, by a horse's misstep, by a wound too deep to hide. Not slain by a warrior's blade, not even by betrayal, but by chance. An accident. And in the centuries that followed, his descendants would carry his empire in their veins and his mystery in their silence. For no one, not even a god of war, is spared the absurdity of fate. Far across the world, beyond the ice-choked rivers of the north, another monarch would be taken not by illness or war, but by a quiet accidental slip, in a bathroom tiled with porcelain and pride, where a single moment of imbalance would turn a ruler into a relic in the blink of an eye. The modern palaces of the 20th century no longer bore turrets or battlements, but they gleamed with polished brass and marble, lined with chandeliers instead of arrow slits, and echoed not with the shuffle of armoured guards, but with the hush of velvet slippers and the flicker of electric bulbs. In such a world where the crown was now ceremonial and power measured more in photographs than proclamations, death still came for kings as it always had, unexpected, indiscriminate and often undignified. King Alexander I of Greece was not meant to rule. Born in 1893, the second son of King Constantine I, he was thrust onto the throne in 1917 during the turmoil of World War I, after his father and elder brother were forced into exile. Alexander was young, uncertain, and isolated. His position secured more by Allied pressure than by public will. The court, stripped of familiar faces, became a gilded prison. His father was gone, his mother, Queen Sophia, exiled. He was surrounded by ministers who distrusted him and advisers who treated him as a puppet. And yet Alexander found solace where he could, in long walks through the royal gardens at Tatoi Palace, and in his forbidden marriage to Aspasia Manos, a commoner, a scandal that cost him nearly all remaining ties to the old royal court. But it was in that same garden, far from palace intrigue and politics, that fate chose to strike. On the afternoon of October 2nd, 1920, the king was strolling through the estate grounds with his German shepherd when a fracas erupted near the courtyard. A pet Barbary macaque, kept by a palace staff member, had gotten loose. As the dog approached, barking, the monkey lashed out. Alexander, attempting to separate the animals, was bitten on the leg and hand by the enraged monkey. The wounds seemed minor. He was treated on site by the palace physician, who cleaned and dressed them. But in the days that followed, his condition worsened. Fever spiked. His legs swelled grotesquely. The wounds, ignored as superficial, had become infected, sepsis spreading like fire through a body unprepared for it. Doctors debated amputation, but hesitated. The king, just 27 years old, grew delirious. His speech faltered. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering the names of his exiled family and his young wife, whom the court refused to allow at his side. The infection spread to his bloodstream. Antibiotics did not yet exist. There was no stopping it. On October 25th, after weeks of agony, King Alexander died, ravaged by infection brought on not by war or conspiracy, but by a monkey's teeth and a delay in treatment. His death triggered a political crisis. With no direct heir and the royal line in chaos, Greece stumbled into a republic, then reeled back toward monarchy. A century of instability followed, shaped in part by the absurdity of a sovereign claimed by something so trivial. The monkey was killed, though none could agree whether it was the original culprit. Some whispered that the entire affair had been fate's revenge for Alexander's unpopular marriage, others that it was a dark symbol, a king unloved, unguarded, struck down not by traitor or tyrant, but by the chaos of a garden left untended. And in the quiet moments that followed, when the body was finally laid to rest in the royal cemetery, the wind passed through the olive groves and the marble columns of Tatoi like a breath drawn and never quite released. The garden, once peaceful, became a symbol of loss. A king, in the prime of youth, brought low, not by dagger or illness, but by an animal no taller than a child. A kingdom destabilized by a bite, a dynasty altered by infection. And in this, perhaps more than any other, was the greatest irony of royal death, that no matter how high the throne, how heavy the crown, how golden the legacy, it takes only the smallest thing, an iron poker, a pastry, a doorway, a step, a fall or a monkey, to end it all. And so the world turns and the crowns fall, one by one, in glory or in shame, in fire or in laughter, and sometimes in silence.